Parshas HaParsha and beautiful Ner Avram. And we're going to be learning a piece from Moshe Shapira Zatzal that I learned with my Chavrusa on his yahrzeit about something from Parshas Vayechi that leads into the whole concept of Golus Mitzrayim. And as we said, Golus Mitzrayim was not just poor working conditions. That's why Yitzias Mitzrayim, the going out of Mitzrayim, was not just an international event of, liberation from slavery that some people try to make it into, but it was something unique to Am Yisrael. Both the Golus and the Geula were unique to Am Yisrael. So we're going to take a deeper look at it through his words. Moshe starts off with an interesting question. You find in the Sfarim that Golus Mitzrayim, the exile in Egypt, was, so to speak, the root of all Goliot. Oi, you okay?
The water is much hotter than it should be.
So it's the root of all Goliot. I'll tell you a cute story about that just once it came up. I heard this from Rabbi Zion Twersky, who was the nephew of the Baba Rebbe, Rav Shlomo Halberstam Zatzal. So he said when he was learning in the yeshiva in New York, in the Bava Yeshiva, so they used to take turns, a bacher, to bring the tea to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, like some European Jews liked his tea so hot, it would be like bubbling in the cup. So there was one boy who was to bring him the tea at the tish that he was sitting at. And as he approached the Rebbe, the boy stumbled and he poured the tea right into the Rebbe's lap. So the Rebbe, without flinching, he says, "How many times do I have to tell them I like my tea to be hot?" And he was just so impressed by that, So he said, we always say that Mitzrayim is the great granddaddy of all Galuyot, right? It's the root of all Galus, of all exile, of everything that means. So it's strange that we find none of the hints to it in the Torah. Chazal identify hints to what we call the four Malchios, the four kingdoms. For example, in the beginning of Bereshis, right? So it's Tohu, Vavohu, V'choshech al Pnei Tehom. So Chazal say Tohu is Bavel, Vohu is Paras Modai, Persia Media, Choshech is Yavon, Greece, and Tehom, the depths, is Edom, Romi, what we're still in. Now, why doesn't it talk about Mitzrayim? Right? It's just the beginning of Bereshit. It hadn't happened yet. If there's going to be hints to future Goliaths, why not Mitzrayim? So the answer is, he says, is because when something is a source, so that almost doesn't appear. In other words, the source of something lies under the surface. It lies under the surface, and then, if need be, when Am Yisrael don't follow what they're supposed to, then comes the Golus of Bavel, etc. Maybe we can compare it a little bit to something the Sfas Emes says about Shabbos. Right? One of the drushes that Chazal say about Shabbos is Vayevorech also. It says in the Torah, Hashem blessed Shabbos. Chazal say, how did he bless Shabbos? Bercho b'mon. He blessed it with the mon. But the Sfas Emes asks, there was no mon on Shabbos. Right, that's very strange. And what do you mean? So the simple explanation is somehow the doubling of the mon on Erev Shabbos showed the covet of Shabbos. But he says, no, think of what we say in the Chadodi. Mikra Shabbos l'chuven elcha, ki hi makor habracha. Shabbos is the source of bracha. That's why you don't see the tangible bracha on Shabbos. All the bracha you see during the week has its source on Shabbos. All the mon that came through the week had its source on Shabbos. So lahavdil, here, Mitzrayim, he says, is the source of all Goliaths. But now he asks another question. Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. So therefore, if we were in the ultimate source of all Goliaths, and Hashem redeemed us from there, and we even describe it in davening, we say, Vayotzi esamu Yisrael mitocham lecherus olam. Hashem took his nation, Am Yisrael, out of Egypt, lecherus olam, for eternal freedom. So how is it we could become subjugated to other kingdoms, to Bavel and to Yavon and to all of those? How could it be? So clearly, he says, there must be something that was missing or that we lost from Yitzias Mitzrayim that made us vulnerable to conquest by all of these others. We add into this, before he gets into explaining a very strange pasuk in Parshas Kisavo, the end of the Tochacha. Right, the Tochacha is all of those punishments, curses. Again, I always quote Rav Chaim Friedlander, who says that Hashem's punishments are never, right, revenge. They're tikkun, they're repair, but sometimes very painful repair. And the last of those is very, very strange. It says, "Ve'ashivcha Hashem Mitzrayim ba'aniyos." Hashem will cause you to go back to Egypt in ships. "Baderech asher amati lecha lo tosif od lerosa." In the way that I told you, you're never going to see that again. "V'izmakartem shom le'oivecha," and you will sell yourselves there to your enemies, la'avodim v'lishlachos, to be slaves and maidservants. Ve'ein koneh, nobody's going to buy you. That's a very, very strange picture. That's the last of the 98 klolos that are in that tochacha. It seems to be describing a reversal of the Yetzias Mitzrayim process. A total reversal. One that's so pitiful that Am Yisrael, the traveling reverse, says, why does it say with ships? He says, because they're coming, again, from all over the Golos, from where they're scattered, right? So they never went to Egypt in ships. You go land route from Eretz Yisrael, from other places, Asia, he says. They're coming from all over the world in ships, meaning from a distance, trying to sell themselves to Egypt. And that is the most frightening image out of all those curses which is there. So what could it mean? So he says like this. From that pasuk, we seem to see that the deepest golus is for people to be avadim. Now, there's a difference from being a slave to being enslaved. In the piyut, Ashkenazim say at the end of the kinnis on the day on Tisha B'Av, Elit Zion, so one of the things which we cry about, it says, Al inui b'nei chorin, on the suffering and subjugation of free men. Right? That's an interesting mix in which is there. So he explains that there is a person who is naturally a slave, who is be'etzem a slave, meaning his very essence is a slave. So then when he's enslaved, that isn't as painful, as terrible. In fact, right, if a slave who is a person who's a slave, but in essence is looking for a master. He's looking for a master, and sometimes even if the new master is worse, the conditions are worse, it isn't so different from his situation before. But if a person is free, who's not actually an Eved, so that is a tremendous level of suffering. And that's the picture of Am Yisrael, right, at the time of the Churban. Now, Avraham Avinu was told, as we'd mentioned before, Golus Mitzrayim didn't come about because of, whoops, you did something wrong, and therefore you're in Golus Mitzrayim. Avraham Avinu was told that what's called the Bris Ben Absari in Parshas Lech Lecha, right? Ger Yezaracha Beretz Lehem, your children will be strangers in a strange land. Va'avadum ve'inu osam arba me'os shana. And they will enslave them and subjugate them, cause them to suffer for 400 years. He says, what is that double mention? Right? Va'avadum ve'inu osam. He says, ve'inu osam would mean that they make them work for them, that they don't treat them well, that they cause them to suffer. Va'avadum means they will make you avadim. They will make you slaves in your essence. That is the transformation. That was the power of Egypt to turn people into people who are essentially slaves. And this explains the puzzling line in the Haggadah. In the Haggadah we say, if Hashem hadn't taken our forefathers out of Egypt, we and our children and children's children, etc., would all still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Why? Governments change, right? Slavery gets outlawed. All sorts of things happen in history. It's been a long time since then. So he says what it means is that we would have constantly remained avodim, in essence. Meaning, if we don't have that one Paro, we'd go looking for another Paro. If we don't have that Mitzrayim, we'd go looking for another Mitzrayim, right? The geula that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did was to take us out of actually being avodim and to make us people who are essentially b'nei chorim, who are essentially free. Now, this applies, people may be breathing a sigh of relief, saying, okay, well, Baruch Hashem, it hasn't happened to us, we haven't been enslaved that much. True, Stalin had his labor camps, and there were Jewish slaves certainly throughout history. But he says the real idea of being Eved ve'etzem, and I'll just read you a little bit of his description of it. He says that the idea of an Eved ve'etzem means it is a person who is not his own master. Even if there's no master over him, he's not able to be master over himself. He says most people in the world can't even think for themselves or decide for themselves or determine the course of their lives. If they weren't part of a group, they wouldn't know what to do. He says a person gets up in the morning and he goes to shul or he doesn't go to shul, depending on what his group is doing. He goes to this supermarket or that supermarket. He says there are very small points of choices that he makes there. Do I go to this supermarket or that supermarket, or this shul or that shul? But he says the idea of being like others, looking for something to grab onto, and the idea that if he were somehow on his own, he wouldn't be able to manage. He says this is something that is out there in the world. And that is an aspect of Avdut. That's an aspect of this slavery. Okay, now again, this doesn't mean that a person doesn't join a community, right? It's a good thing to have. And the Rambam tells us clearly in Hilchos Deos, a person is going to be influenced by his surroundings. That's a fact of human life. So therefore, pick your surroundings carefully, right? Try to pick that. But the problem is, and this Rabbi Yisrael Salanter pointed out when he looked around this generation, it's like what it says in Yeshayahu, Vatihi Yerosam Osi, their fear of me was mitzvahs anoshim lumoda. It was simply monkey see, monkey do. Okay? And a lot of times that is itself a form of slavery which can be there. So this is the concept. A person who is an Eved be'etzem, who's truly an Eved, can be even someone walking around making a lot of money, right? Without a slave master hitting him with a whip, but nonetheless he can be enslaved. This is how he explains what it says in the Medrash, famous statement that says that until Am Yisrael went out of Mitzrayim, there was never a slave that left Mitzrayim. He said that's not because they weren't able to, it was because they didn't want to. They couldn't conceive of it, right? And again, there are different opinions about the different times in the Midbar when things got tough, and Am Yisrael kept saying, let's go back to Mitzrayim, right? That this is bad. So he says, in certain ways, this was the very nature of Egypt. In other words, it wasn't just Am Yisrael, but the Egyptians themselves. You remember Yosef had them all sell themselves as slaves to Pharaoh. It was an entire nation of slaves. Now, they're described in a pasuk as Basar Chamorim Basaram. Their flesh of the Egyptians is the flesh of donkeys. Right? Now the donkey, he says, the Maharal explains, comes from the word chomer, material, meaning molded. Right? It represents something that can be what you make it be, what you tell it to be. So that was, right, the nature of Mitzrayim. Now the anti-Mitzrayim, the anti-Avdus to the maximum was Yaakov Avinu. There's in the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Kuf Yud Ches, it says that you will get an inheritance, not like Avram, who was told to walk Eretz Yisrael la'orko u'lerachba, length and width. Not like Yitzchak, where Hashem said, "Es kol had ratzos ha'el," all of these lands I will give to you, but like Yaakov. Yaakov has Nachlas Yaakov Avicha, the inheritance of your father Yaakov, Nachalo bevli mitzarim, an inheritance without boundaries. Mitzarim is the same letters as Mitzrayim. That which limits, that which shrinks, makes tsar, makes narrow, mina meitzar, that is Mitzrayim. So therefore, Yaakov was the exact opposite of Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was there to be able to shrink people into limited spaces that are defined by them from above. I was wondering, I was just thinking out loud there, these midrashim, that Paro was a midget, right? Perhaps it was even an idea that he was shrinking people into a world of smallness that was ruled over by smallness. Don't know, that was just a thought. Okay, so therefore, Yaakov Avinu, when Yaakov dies, that is when they say the Shibud started. That is when the Gullus started, even though the whole Parsha of them starting off the Jews with the slavery came later. But they no longer had this connection to Yaakov, who was the anti-Mitzrayim, who was the anti-limitations, who was that of Nachala B'li Mitzarim. And therefore, that was when it began. So, going back to last week, we spoke about the Chazal that said that Yaakov Avinu wanted to reveal the ketz to them. He wanted to reveal the end. And clearly that wasn't a date, right, sometime in the future. What he wanted to explain to them is the following, that every Golus, the Golus itself is supposed to bring its own end. The Golus itself is supposed to bring its own limitation, its own end, because it's supposed to clarify to us how limiting it is, how much it cannot be the point of life or the way of life. Meaning, when Am Yisrael are put in a Golus, they're put in Mitzrayim, they're put in Mitzarim, we're supposed to recognize this isn't the way we're supposed to live. This can't be, right? This is Inui B'nei Chorin. We're essentially supposed to be B'nei Chorin. We are Nachala B'li Mitzarim, and here we find ourselves in so many different forms of Mitzrayim. That's what's meant. Chazal say, he says that when Avram Avinu was told, right, with the Gezerah of Golus, he said, Yodoa Teida Ki Geri Azacha. Why the double Lashon? Yodoa Teida. You should know, you will know. So Chazal said, Ki Geri Azacha, right? You should know your children will be these strangers. Hashem says, Teida Shani Mafazron. Know that I will scatter them. Teida Shani Machnisan. You should know that I will gather them. Yodoa Shani Mamashkenon. That I'll give them over as collateral. Teida Shani Porkon. Know that I will redeem them. Yodoa Shani Meshabdon. Know that I will enslave them, subjugate them. Teida Shani Goalam. Meaning, if a person truly understands Golus and understands the nation of Golus, it's almost like, if you press down on a spring, a strong spring, and you're pressing, eventually the spring springs back. It is not meant to be pressured, it's not meant to be squeezed into that space. So that is what is supposed to happen with Golus. That was what Yaakov Avinu wanted people to be able to look at the Golus and say, you see, it's all here. It's all built to bring about its own end, to bring about the Geula. But that wasn't something he was allowed to show us clearly. It's something that we have to look into. It's something that we have to try to see and sense. So what we have, right, is Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. It's true, the Cherus Olam. At the time of Har Sinai, so Am Yisrael was more or less almost like in the state of Adam Harishon. Right? Adam Harishon was so powerful. Vatachasrel ma'at me'elokim, it says, until he was just a little bit less than God. That's this idea of tzelem Elokim. It's explained in the Nefesh HaChaim. What is the idea of tzelem Elokim, who was created in the image of God? See someone, you remind me of someone, God, right? You look like God. What does that mean? And why tzelem Elokim instead of tzelem Hashem, tzelem Shakai? Why that name? Elokim is Baal Kol HaKochos Kulam. When Chazal said that Adam Harishon went misofo olam vad sofo, it doesn't mean he was like really, really tall. It means that the entire world, so to speak, was inside of Adam Harishon. Right? Chazal talk about Adam Harishon being made from all of the world, meaning he was able to impact everything in the world and to transform it and to elevate it. And that's what he was supposed to do. After the Chet, it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu put his hand on him, and miaton, the mea amos. Why Mea Amos, I don't know, but it means he shrank him, he limited him, right? And that process of limitation was almost reversed at Har Sinai, but then came Chet HaEgel. And once again, we became susceptible to being enslaved. And that chain can go on so far to the ultimate degradation where Am Yisrael are trying to return to Mitzrayim, are such avodim be'etzim, they're looking for a master to buy them and be master over them, and nobody even wants them. But that itself brings about the turnaround. when they realize that it's true, I've become such an Eved, but deep, deep inside, I'm B'nai Chorin. Deep, deep inside, there's what's called Yisrael Saba, right? There's Yaakov Avinu is always inside of us. And when we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we're connecting to Yaakov Avinu and reminding ourselves that this is not our reality, that this is not our limitation. And the key, he says, has to be that a person at least feels that this isn't the way it's supposed to be. That your feeling in Golus is, it's not supposed to be like this. We are limited. We are a shadow of who we're meant to be, of who we're supposed to be. The famous story, the Chernobyl Maggid was staying over in the house of a simple farmer, and at Chatzos, at midnight, he started saying Tikkun Chatzos, special tefillas and tehillim, which are said about the Churban. So the farmer hears the man crying, he gets all worried about him, and he says, no, it's just Tikkun Chatzos. He said, what's this Tikkun Chatzos thing? He says, we're crying about the Churban, right, and davening for the Geula and to return to Eretz Yisrael. He says, well, like really? He says, yeah, we are going to return to Eretz Yisrael. Mashiach is going to come. We're going to return to Eretz Yisrael, and we have to be ready to go. He said, I got to ask my wife about this. So he goes, telling his wife, comes back, he says, my wife says, no, nothing doing, because we just bought some new cows, right, and our chickens are up, they're laying really well, so we can't go. So he said, you have to tell your wife that it'll be much better than here. You have the goyim making pogroms, and they steal your chickens, and they steal your cows. Over there, it'll be so much better. So he comes back, he said, my wife says Hashem should send the goyim to Eretz Yisrael, so they'll stop stealing our chickens, and meanwhile leave us alone. So he said, I've got to talk to your wife. And he sat with the wife for a long time until she agreed that it is not good to be in Golus, and that it would be better if we have the Geula. Right? And this, I think it was with Shapira Zilberberg, he said, for this we see, why did he spend so much time on this? Because every Jew has to feel this. Every Jew has to sense this. And to feel comfortable and good in Golus is like this sleep of death that it falls on us. It doesn't mean a person isn't meant to be b'simcha. Of course, we're Ovid Hashem b'simcha. It doesn't mean we're not supposed to function well and take care of ourselves in Golus. We are. But to realize that it's a fraction of ourselves, and like the Sfas Emes says, the word Golus really comes from the word legalot, to reveal. That pressure that's on us in Golus is supposed to reveal our greatness. It's supposed to bring it out again. So that's what we have in the end. He says, at least what we have to do is remember where we come from. We come from that Adam Harishon. We come from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We come from all these things. We remember what we're connected to. We remember what we yearn for, what we aspire to, and what our true existence is meant to be. Okay, that's like they say, Kola misabel al Yerushalayim zocha v'roa b'binyona. A person who's mourning about Yerushalayim, why is it present tense zocha v'roa? If you're mourning about Yerushalayim, that means you have a concept of what Yerushalayim is meant to be. You see it. Only a person who sees it can actually be mourning about it. So just to finish with, I was listening to a history talk, Rabbi Hirsch, Aubrey Hirsch from London, is a famous one. So he told the story, he was talking about Vienna and the history of Vienna, and there was a rabbi in Vienna, Rabbi Flesch, who was a Talmud of Chasam Sofer, and then he learned in Frankfurt. So he had a small shul there, which was a very fromm, devout shul. And when Sarah Schneer, right, this young woman from Poland, her family went there during World War I, so she saw the shul, she went into the shul, it was Hanukkah time, she heard him give a drasha about Yehudis. And she said, that struck her, and she started going to every shir he gave. She would sit in the ladies section, listen to every shir. And she said, this is what's happening. In Poland, the girls have forgotten who we are, who we're supposed to be. If they would recognize their greatness, if they would recognize what they're supposed to be, and that was what she took back to do that. I know a descendant of Rabbi Flesch. It was a pivotal moment in the history of Jewish education that took place in that little shul in Vienna, and that was the secret ingredient, right? That we have to remember who we're supposed to be, and if we have been dwarfed, if we have been shrunk by the Mitzarim, at least to recognize it. Right? And to understand that it's there. And once you feel that, you're already on the way out of Egypt. Have a wonderful week.